Hi, I'm Will Howard, and I'm in beautiful downtown Easton, Maryland. 400 years ago, the sidewalk that I'm walking on right now, exactly this spot, was an Indian trail. It was wide enough for a couple of horses to come through and trees all around. That's pretty hard to believe. In the 1630s, colonists came here from Europe and discovered the beauty of Talbot County and its 600 miles of waterfront. Back in the late 1600s, they actually established courts in Talbot County, but the courtrooms were in the homes of the justices because there was no really decent courthouse. In 1794, this beautiful building was built. Now, there were additions back in the 1950s on each side of it, but it is absolutely one of the most beautiful courthouses I've ever seen. There's a monument here to the soldiers that fought for the South. I'm told in history that the Confederates raised the money because the Confederates had more money. The Union statue was never built, but there were 5 times more soldiers in Talbot County on the Union side than the Confederate side. Now, you all elected me in November of last year to be judge of the Orphans Court. And I've had literally dozens of people come up to me and ask, what does the Orphans Court do? We're going to find out what the Orphans Court does. You won't find any orphans up there. We're going to find out what the Circuit Court does, and we're going to find out about District Court, which moved from this location a few years ago, actually about 20 years ago. Let's go inside and talk to all the judges and let them tell us what goes on there. One warning, you can't bring sidearms and you can't bring cell phones into this building. The state of Maryland made it secure after some incidents, and you have to walk through a metal detector.
Come in.
Judge Ernest.
Well, how are you, sir?
I'm very impressed with your chambers.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Come visit.
Do you have ladders to get up to all these books?
No, I have an agile law clerk
Oh, you do?
who can climb up there, because I confess I can't reach the top ones.
This is beautiful. Has this always been the Circuit Court's judge chambers?
You know, they've tinkered with it over the years, but basically it's been back here for a long time.
Well, it's beautiful. I got lost on the way trying to find your chambers, and I ran into what I believe is the old music hall.
Yeah, you probably did, at the other end of the...
Before we talk about Circuit Court, can we tell us a story about that?
Yeah, you want to sit here and do it, or do you want to...
Let's go back there.
Okay, I'll take it back. And say hello to Will. This is the official
Hi, Charlie.
courthouse.
Yeah.
Dog. Charlie, come here. Charlie, come here.
Hey, baby.
Smelling our dog. That is really cool.
So this is the old music hall. And it's an interesting story about this building. There's some old pictures I've seen of the courthouse grounds in which, if you go back far enough, like the late 1800s, this building was self-standing and it was not connected with the courthouse on that side like it is today. I think that happened in 1897 or thereabouts, and I think last time they rebuilt the courthouse. And this became kind of an appendage on the back end of the courthouse. But somehow, the curious part of the story is that somehow, in the early to mid-1900s, they kind of lost track of this building. They stopped using it as a music hall, and somebody walled it off back there, and nobody went in here for many years. And after a while, people forgot about it, and they opened it up just a few years ago, and then it was like a revelation. Oh, we have a music hall.
It was a wow, just like we had,
Yeah,
right?
And so here it is. And ever since then, people have been trying to figure out what to do with it. And of course, from my point of view, I think it would make a lovely courtroom, particularly a ceremonial court. There are a lot of things you could do with it. Judge Kehoe, who was our resident judge from the Court of Special Appeals, also covets it for his chambers, I know. But as a practical matter, given the financial hard times of the county, no one seems to think that there are going to be funds available anytime soon to remodel it. But someday, It'll be a beautiful space.
Well, thank goodness they didn't tear it up.
Right. It'll be preserved. I think the Historical Commission has seen to that.
Good, that's great. Now I'd like to go to the courtroom.
All right, let's go take a look.
This is one of the most beautiful courtrooms. I think it's the most beautiful courtroom I've ever seen. I haven't seen many circuit courtrooms, but as a reporter, as a journalist back in the 60s and 70s, I did see some courtrooms, and they weren't nearly as beautiful as this.
Well, I've been in most of the courtrooms throughout the state, just about every county, and I think this is my favorite. It's not just because I sit here, it's just pretty. Some of them are old and dowdy, and some are brand new and modern looking, but I think this is a nice blend of the old that's been restored. This dome ceiling is particularly unusual.
It is.
Reminds me a little bit of the dome ceiling over in the Avalon, you know?
Right,
It doesn't
yes.
have the nice
Or in the
stained
Capitol,
glass. Yeah.
where your voice carries
Yep.
unusually. Now, there was a very famous movie filmed here. It's called The First Kiss. It was 1920, I think it was.
Gary Cooper.
Fay Wray.
And there's a scene in the courtroom, and I haven't seen the movie, and from what you say, the movie's unfortunately lost, and nobody seems to have a copy of it. But there's a still photograph. I wish I had it here. I tried to pull it out when you were coming over, but I couldn't find it. But at some point I'll find it. But it's a picture taken during the movie, and there's a judge sitting up here on the bench, and it's the same basic setup. The courtroom's been remodeled since then, but
this courtroom is over 200 years old, right? It's 1794?
well, you know, it depends on who you ask. I have one book about historical buildings in Talbot County that suggests that the original building on this site was built in the 1600s.
It was, but it was raised.
That probably is the case.
And then a second one was built, and then they outgrew that, so they raised that, and they built this in 1794.
Well, I know there's a cornerstone on the building out here that you can see, which indicates that the building was redone in the late, I think in 1897 or thereabouts.
I think 1888.
Maybe it's 1888. There's a cornerstone out back that says 1897, and I get those two dates confused. But in one iteration or another, it's been here for a long time.
Let's talk about circuit court and how this is different from the other courts.
Okay.
You are the chief judge, is that correct?
I'm the only judge, so but I have the title of administrative judge. Each county has an administrative judge. In a big county, like say Montgomery County, where they have 23 or 4 judges, you have one administrative judge, and the rest of them are just circuit court judges. In the small counties, I have both titles. I'm the administrative court judge. But the basic difference between this court, the circuit court, and your court, the orphans court or the district court, it has to do with the severity of the crimes that we have jurisdiction over. The more serious crimes come up here from the district court.
And that's because you have the option for a jury.
That's right.
But the other courts don't.
No jury in the district court. We do. And then on the civil side of the ledger, the more serious economic issues come up here as well. Once again, people can have jury trials in civil cases just like criminal cases, although the main difference is in a civil case you only get 6 jurors, in a criminal case you get 12. But other than that, it's the same idea.
Let's take a look at the jury box. And then there's a jury room that we'll get a shot of later. How are the jurors selected? And I know many people are irritated when they are notified that they will have to serve on a jury. And let's talk about that for a second. From being a student of covering stories, know that when you're sitting in that chair, it's very important for you to have a good jury.
You bet.
And I've served as foreman on 2 jury trials, and I know how important it is. If you think about, darn, I got to serve jury duty, I got to call every night and all those things, but it could be you that was charged with a crime.
Right, or a family member or a good friend. Well, I'll tell you how I feel about jury duty, quite simply. I know some people regard it as a chore and a nuisance, something to be avoided. But as you say, quite correctly, if you or a member of your family or a good friend had a case here, you darn sure want the best jury you could find. And the other thought that comes to mind is once you sit on a jury and actually have the experience, I think a lot of people find it a very enjoyable and a gratifying experience. What people don't like, of course, is the time away from their jobs and their families. But the fact of the matter is most of our jury trials, the big majority of them are only a day. Mm-hmm. People have in their mind this notion that they'll get caught in some trial that'll go on for weeks and weeks. They're very rare. The average trial is 1 day in this court. Jury comes in the morning, the jury's selected, this trial actually begins before lunch. By late in the afternoon, we send the jury out there and they deliberate, they bring the jury verdict back, and it's all done in 1 day. So for the average case, it's not that big a time commitment. And the people that I've talked to about their experience, for the most part, enjoyed it.
I enjoyed mine, particularly since the person who was charged with the crime, in both cases, were found not guilty. That was, and it was based on the testimony that we heard on both sides. And when we went back in the jury room, almost everybody agreed that the person was innocent. And while the prosecutors weren't happy about that, we did the right thing and we saved this guy. So,
well, it's you're talking about the feeling of satisfaction that comes with doing your job as a juror, and I think that's a tremendous thing. It's also our civic duty, but putting that aside, it's a great experience for many people.
It was interesting. There were about 80 people in the second time I was here, and I only recognized one person in the room, and these are Talbot County citizens.
Well, we have 36,000 or thereabouts citizens now. It's hard to know them all.
I remember back in the 50s when everybody knew everybody.
Well, if you go back far enough, the way they used to get jurors in the old days, when they didn't need as many, when they decided they needed jurors, the judge would say, "Sheriff, go out there and round up the jurors." And the sheriff would walk out on Washington Street, and the first guy that ambled down the street, he would take him by the lapel and say, "Come on in, you're going to serve on the jury."
I hadn't heard that.
And then as time went by, the next phase was that the judge would get together with the trial lawyers, who were just a small group at this point in our history, and he would say, "Who do you recommend for the jury?" And the lawyers would recommend certain people for the jury that they thought would be good jurors, and the judge would summons just those in. Well, times have changed, and now it's all done randomly by a computer from the voter rolls and the Motor Vehicle Administration rolls. So if you're a voter and you have a driver's license, you're probably going to get a jury notice.
Well, what does that do in terms of the Hispanic population here? If they can't speak English, does that mean they're not going to be a juror?
Well,
or do they get an interpreter, or how does that work?
That's a good question. Now, we use interpreters for the parties, like a criminal defendant's entitled to have an interpreter, but we don't use interpreters for jurors. I think that the general rule is, and this is evolving as more and more Hispanic speaking folks are coming into the community, so I don't know where it's going to end up, but at this stage, we insist that all jurors have the ability to read and write, because the jurors have to be able to read the juror qualification form that the clerk sends to them.
In English?
In English, and they have to be able to read exhibits that might be introduced into evidence, and of course they have to speak English. So that's still a prerequisite.
Tell me what these people do here.
Well, the clerk of the court sits here, and the clerk of the court is in charge of making the official docket entries, all done by computer now, of course, but making official docket entries to record what happens, so that if a jury comes in and says the man's guilty, the clerk of the court makes that docket entry, and that's the official record. In civil cases, if a jury comes in and says we award $100,000 to the plaintiff, the clerk gets it down.
The clerk does more than that too. She rounds up the jury and makes sure they're here, does the paperwork, et cetera.
Well, that's always been the case up until now. As of the 1st of July, I have a new jury commissioner who will be taking over that role from the clerk of the
It's a big
court.
job.
It is.
One question about the jury. What happens if somebody doesn't show up? Just ignores the...
No, well, if somebody doesn't show up, we don't ignore it, but if they ignore us, the sheriff goes out and rounds them up and brings them in. And they have to stand up here the next day in front of me, and I ask them why they weren't here. The state legislature has empowered judges to impose jail sentences for up to 60 days if a juror willfully fails to come to court, or impose a fine of up to $1,000.
That's serious.
It is. Now, that said, I've never had to do it because I've never had anybody refuse to come willfully to jury duty. There are always a few people that just don't get it right. They forget or they misunderstand the instruction that they got on the telephone when they call in the night before. I've never had anybody just outright refuse, but
Well, if they knew what the consequences were, I'm sure they wouldn't.
I'm sure they would.
Is this the person that does the audio recording, or?
This is our court, this is the recorder, and she operates an electronic recording system. And when I first started trying cases here, we had old-fashioned longhand pen writers, we call them, that would write shorthand accounts. We had a guy named Ernie Gretzinger who was here for years and years. And when I first came to court here in 1973, Ernie was an old guy then, but he could still write fast as lightning. But he was getting tired in his old age. And when he'd get tired and the judge wouldn't give him a break, Ernie would start slowly cursing. And the judge at the time was a little hard of hearing, and so everybody would start tittering in the courtroom because everybody could hear it except the judge. Finally, we'd take mercy and ask for a recess, and Ernie would flop his hands down in relief. But nowadays, we do it all electronically.
Now, in district court, the backup system records everything, and we would be recording us right now, correct?
That's correct. And we have microphones strategically placed around. And
So
this is very helpful because in a given case, not only can we get a transcript typed up of everything that's been recorded, but I can go back and listen to an argument if I wish before I make a decision. I can rehear the case in that way.
the defendant or plaintiff sits there, and the prosecutor?
Prosecutor sits there in criminal cases, and defendant and his attorney sit here. We also have bailiffs who preside over the court and shuffle papers back and forth, and they go out and get witnesses, and they're court officials that are here whenever we have a jury trial. Any kind of trial, they're here.
How should people dress when they come to court?
Well, my bailiff is very hard on them. If somebody comes in here, I call him the fashion police, because if somebody comes in short pants or something that is generally not deemed appropriate, he'll send them out, and we have to go out and change clothes and come back. And so those are my bailiffs. So we also have deputy sheriffs, and they provide courthouse security. They're all very good. They're armed, they're trained, most former police officers, and we always have a couple of them here in the courtroom, just in case. And and then I have my clerk, my judicial clerk, who is a graduate of law school, who is a member of the bar, and young lawyers like to clerk for a judge for a year. He sits right here and listens to everything, and he and I can discuss the case.
Was that him sitting outside your office with piles and piles and
Yes.
piles of paper?
That's poor Julian, my current clerk, back there surrounded by books. That's his life.
How did you become a judge? You were elected, weren't you?
I was. Under our system, you start off by being appointed by the governor. And I was appointed by Governor O'Malley in 1997, and, 2007. And then
I was going to say, time really flies.
it doesn't fly quite that fast. And then our Constitution provides that the judge has to run in one general election that follows after his appointment. So I was, as I say, appointed in 2007, and then in 2008, I ran in a general election. I happened to win both primaries in February of that year, so I didn't have to actually go through a contested election in the general election that followed. But that's the way it works, and any lawyer can decide to run against you. I had some fellows that decided
I remember you did. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the general public about the circuit court?
Well, yeah, I would say it's an honor to serve the county as the circuit court judge. I'm the only circuit court judge in the county, so I feel a understandable lot of responsibility to try to get it right.
How long does it take somebody to get in front of you once they file? What's your backlog?
In criminal cases, they're entitled to, by our Constitution, to a speedy trial, which the courts have said is 6 months. So we have 180 days to get criminal cases to trial.
Now that may seem like a long time, but there's a lot of preparation on both sides that are required before they come to you.
There is, and most of them get tried within that time period. It's possible to waive that if there are unavoidable delays, but the big majority of them get tried within that 6-month period. Civil cases sort of take a back seat to the criminal cases for a good reason.
Right.
A lot of the defendants are locked up, and they will remain, in many cases, incarcerated until their trial. So there's an understandable reason why we give priority to criminal cases. The civil cases, take a year or more to get to trial from the time they're filed. But this isn't bad compared to most courts, I can tell you. The bigger venues like Baltimore City or Montgomery County or Prince George's County, where they have such a huge volume, it's much harder to get to trial in a civil case. Sometimes it can be 2 or 3 years.
But I was able to bring an emergency petition and got seen within 2 hours. That's different.
It is, and for emergency situations, we're available here on short notice. And most of those involve things like domestic violence cases where you need to...
I've got to go on the record. This was
not your domestic violence.
It was a political...
Yours was a political case that
Right.
I remember well, but most of the emergency things fall into the domestic violence category. We also have injunctive proceedings if somebody's seeking a court injunction to stop something from happening or to force something to happen. It can work either way because there's some emergency, and if the court doesn't intervene and order something right away, all will be lost. And those cases come up from time to time, and we hear those on the spur of the moment. Circuit Court's a busy place. We grant adoptions, we grant divorces on the domestic side of the ledger. We conduct all these criminal cases, both jury and non-jury trials. In the last couple of years, we've been inundated with foreclosures. All those come through here, and
Wow.
they've been just increasing all along, unfortunately. There's hardly a day that goes by that we don't have to deal with them. We have child support cases. We have guardianship cases. We have administrative appeals. But that's the fascinating thing to me about the whole court. I mean, it's a tremendous variety. So it's very interesting as the judge. you get to see a lot more different cases than you ever would as a private lawyer.
The Orphans Court is very interesting also, and I enjoy
And we
it.
get your cases when they come up on
Yes.
appeal. People have a right to appeal the Orphans Court decisions, and so we'll get those occasionally. But you have a sense of what it's like.
Yes, I do. Well, thank you very much for spending time with us. I'm sure that everybody's going to really enjoy.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you. Look forward to seeing everybody here as a juror, not as a party, I hope.
Okay, good. Thanks so much.
All right, bye-bye. There's a really interesting story about this guy. This is Judge Richard Carmichael, and there's a little summary of it here. But it's going to be the incident that I'll tell you about is 100 years ago next year, and I'm going to do a reenactment of this. It was during the Civil War, and Judge Carmichael was a Southern sympathizer, apparently, and Abraham Lincoln took umbrage at this. So Judge Carmichael had a trial here, and a couple of local guys were charged with sedition, against the government. And as the story goes, Judge Carmichael pretty much told the jury to find him not guilty because he didn't believe in the cause. And this was these were Southern sympathizers for the most part that lived over here in those days. Well, Abraham Lincoln was so incensed, so the story goes, he sent 200 Union troops down here to arrest Judge Carmichael. And they came into the courtroom, they surrounded the courthouse, and they came into the courtroom, and he was conducting a jury trial at the time, and this young lieutenant who was in charge of the troops said, "You're under arrest." And he said, "Not by a long shot. You can't arrest me in my own courtroom." And the lieutenant went up and whopped him over the head with a pistol, knocked him unconscious. They carried him out bodily, took him to a northern prison camp in New York, kept him locked up for 6 months. And the judges around the country apparently were so incensed about this interference, this crossing the boundary between the executive branch and the judicial branch, that they protested, and finally Lincoln relented and ordered him released, and he was never brought to trial. But he came back here, and he was kind of a local hero, and he became a United States Senator, and he represented Maryland in the Continental Congress. And his great-grandson is now living here, Richard Tillman, at White House, who was a former law partner of mine. So if we do the reenactment next year, I'm going to see if I can get Richard to stand in and play the part of his great-grandfather. He's the one that's going to get whacked over the head, though, not me.